It had been snowing for hours. The roads were nearly impassable, the thick, relentless storm reducing visibility to almost nothing. My phone had already chimed with warnings, winter weather advisory, hazardous travel conditions. I ignored them. I'd promised my family I'd make it home for New Year's Eve dinner, and I wasn't about to let a little snow stop me. But now, as my car struggled up the winding road, its tires skidding dangerously on the icy surface, I realized I might have underestimated the storm. The headlights barely penetrated the swirling white, and my hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly they ached. I hadn't seen another car in miles, nor a sign of life, just endless snow-covered trees lining the narrow road. Then, the inevitable happened. The tires spun helplessly as the car skidded to a halt, sliding slightly before stopping completely. I cursed under my breath and tried everything reverse, rocking the car forward, but it was no use. I was stuck, and alone. I grabbed my phone, hoping for a signal. Of course, there was none. Panic flickered at the edge of my thoughts, but I shoved it aside. There had to be a solution. I couldn't stay out here all night. That's when I saw Ida, faint flickering light through the trees. It was barely visible, like the glow of a candle, but it was there. A house, maybe? A cabin? Either way, it was my best chance of getting help. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, pulled on my gloves, and stepped out into the biting cold. The wind cut through me like a knife as I trudged through the snow, each step heavier than the last. The light grew closer, brighter, until I could make out the outline of a house. It was small and old, its paint peeling and roof sagging under the weight of the snow. The light was coming from inside, casting a warm, inviting glow. I climbed the creaking steps to the porch, hesitating for just a moment before knocking on the door. The sound echoed strangely, swallowed by the storm. I knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open. "Hello?" I called, peering inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single oil lamp on a table, its flame flickering. The room was sparsely furnished: a couch, a chair, a fireplace where a small fire burned. It looked lived in, but there was no sign of anyone. I stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. "Hello?" I called again. My car's stuck down the road. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer, just the soft crackle of the fire. I glanced around, uneasy but desperate. The place felt strange, too quiet, too still. But I couldn't go back out into the storm. I decided to wait, hoping the owner would return soon. Minutes passed, then an hour. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling against the windows. I felt drowsy, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the exhaustion of the day. My eyes were just beginning to close when I heard Ita sound outside, footsteps crunching in the snow. I shot to my feet, heart pounding. Relief flooded me. Finally, someone was here. But as I moved to the window, the relief turned to something else: fear. The figure outside was tall and thin, wearing a tattered coat that hung awkwardly on its frame. It moved slowly, deliberately, heading straight for the house. But something was wrong. Its gait was jerky, unnatural, as if it were struggling to walk. And its face. I couldn't see it clearly through the frost-covered glass, but what I could see didn't look human. The figure reached the porch and stopped. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, unmoving, as if it were listening. Then, it turned its head slowly toward the window where I stood. My breath caught in my throat. Its face was pale and gaunt, its eyes dark pits that seemed to bore into me. The door creaked open behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the room was empty. The door hung ajar, the wind howling through the gap. My blood ran cold. When I turned back to the window, the figure was gone. I didn't think. I grabbed my phone, my bag, anything I could carry, and bolted out the door. The storm nearly blinded me, but I didn't care. I ran back to my car, slipping and stumbling in the snow. When I reached it, I locked the doors and sat there, panting, my breath fogging up the glass. The light in the house went out. I stayed in the car all night, too afraid to move, too terrified to sleep. When morning came, the storm had passed and the world was eerily quiet. I stepped out, the snow crunching beneath my boots, and looked toward the house. It was gone. All that remained was a patch of untouched snow, as if nothing had ever been there. The snowstorm began earlier than expected on New Year's Eve. Thick, heavy flakes blanketed the small town in silence, turning the world into a swirling haze of white. I was alone in the house, my wife and daughter away visiting her parents for the holiday. I'd planned to join them the next morning after my shift at the hospital, but the storm had shut down all the roads. I stood at the window, watching the snow fall in waves under the pale light of the street lamp. The silence was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind. With a sigh, I pulled the curtains closed and turned back to the living room. The hours dragged on, the house too quiet. I tried watching TV, but the storm had knocked out the satellite signal. Even my phone showed only a single useless bar of service. I settled on reading a book, the crackle of the fireplace my only companion. That's when I first saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved outside the window. I froze, heart skipping a beat, and turned my head slowly. The curtains were still drawn, but I could see a faint, flickering shadow on the edge of the fabric, as if someone or something was just outside. My rational side took over, probably just a branch swaying in the wind, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I got up, hesitated for a moment, then pulled the curtain aside. The street was empty, the snow untouched except for the drifts piling up on the edges of the road. I sighed, shaking my head at my own paranoia, and turned back to the warmth of the fire. But then I saw it again. This time, it was more than just a shadow. A figure stood at the far edge of the yard, barely visible through the swirling snow. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the storm. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but it was still there. I grabbed my phone and aimed its flashlight out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but by the time it reached the spot, the figure was gone. A chill ran down my spine, colder than the winter air outside. I locked the doors. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but every so often I caught glimpses of the figure. Sometimes it was at the edge of the yard, sometimes closer, but it always disappeared the moment I tried to focus on it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was getting bolder. Around midnight, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and I cursed under my breath, fumbling for the flashlight on my phone. The beam cast long flickering shadows on the walls as I made my way to the kitchen. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping at the window. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. The flashlight's beam trembled as I aimed it at the glass. There it was. The figure stood right outside the window, its face pressed against the glass. The pale, hollow features looked almost human, but not quite. Its eyes were dark, empty pits, and its mouth curved into a grotesque grin that didn't belong on any living thing. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the room, but the sound of the tapping continued, louder now, more insistent. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the garage, throwing the door open and leaping into the driver's seat. The car struggled to start in the cold, but after a few agonizing seconds, the engine roared to life. I reversed out of the driveway, the tires skidding on the icy road, and sped down the empty streets. I didn't know where I was going, just away. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was following me. I didn't stop until I reached the hospital parking lot. the bright lights and presence of other people finally making me feel safe. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel, my breath fogging up the windows. When morning came, the storm had passed, and the town was quiet again. I drove home cautiously, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. The snow in my yard was pristine, untouched. The only footprints were my own. But when I stepped inside, I found a single handprint on the window, long, thin, and not quite human. New Year's Eve was supposed to be uneventful. The storm had been raging since morning, and by nightfall, the entire valley was buried under a thick layer of snow. I was alone in our family cabin, tucked deep in the woods. It had been my idea to spend the holidays there, seeking some solitude to reflect on the past year. The cabin was cozy, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. I had just poured myself a glass of wine when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks at the front door. My heart jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone. Who would be out in this storm? For a moment I thought it might be a branch or debris blown against the door. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate knocks. I grabbed the flashlight and hesitated. I considered ignoring it, but the thought of someone stranded in this weather tugged at my conscience. With a deep breath, I unbolted the door and pulled it open. A man stood there, shivering violently. His face was pale, his lips blue, and his clothes were soaked through. "Please," he croaked, his voice barely audible over the wind. I need help. Come in," I said, stepping aside. He stumbled across the threshold, collapsing into a heap on the floor. I quickly shut the door behind him, locking out the icy wind. The man couldn't have been much older than me, maybe mid-30s, though the frostbite on his cheeks made him look older. I helped him out of his wet jacket and wrapped him in a blanket, guiding him to the chair by the fire. "Thank you," he whispered, teeth chattering. I got lost. My car broke down." His words were disjointed, and his eyes darted around the room like he was expecting someone or something to follow him. "Where's your car?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "Down the road," he said. "Ran out of gas. Thought I could make it to the next house, but..." He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the window. "It's safe here," I assured him. "You'll warm up soon. In the morning I'll help you get to town." He didn't respond, just kept staring at the window. I followed his gaze. Snow was still falling heavily, the glass frosted over. I couldn't see anything unusual, but his unease was contagious. "Is someone else out there?" I asked cautiously. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he turned to me, his face pale and serious. "You didn't see it?" "See what?" "The thing following me." A chill ran down my spine, colder than the wind outside. "What do you mean?" I pressed, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what it is," he said, his voice trembling, "but it's been chasing me since I left the car. I thought I lost it in the storm, but..." He broke off, his eyes widening in terror. "What?" I asked, turning to follow his gaze. Outside, faintly illuminated by the glow of the porch light, was a figure. It stood motionless in the snow, its features obscured by the swirling flakes. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't moving. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the figure. It wasn't a person. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless void, pale and smooth like stretched wax. The man behind me let out a strangled cry. "Turn it off!" he shouted, grabbing my arm. "What?" "The light. It hates the light." I fumbled with the flashlight, turning it off as panic surged through me. In the brief moment before darkness swallowed the room, I thought I saw the figure move closer. We barricaded the door with whatever we could find: chairs, a heavy oak table, even firewood. The man sat by the fire, trembling, muttering to himself. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," he whispered, "but it doesn't stop, it doesn't get tired, and it won't let you leave." I checked the windows, pulling the curtains tightly closed. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I could feel it out there, watching. Hours passed. The storm raged on, and the fire began to die down. I added more logs, but the man shook his head violently. "It doesn't like the dark," he said, "but it doesn't like fire either. Keep it burning." As the clock neared midnight, I realized the storm was beginning to fade. The wind softened, and the snowfall thinned. And then the knocking started again. 3 sharp knocks at the door. I turned to the man, but he was frozen in place, his face pale as death. "It's not someone," he said. "Don't open it, no matter what." The knocking came again, louder this time. And then a voice. "Help me," it said. It wasn't human. It was distorted, like static on a radio. "Please, let me in." I backed away, my heart pounding. "It's lying," the man whispered. The door shook violently, the knocking turning into pounding. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I held my breath, waiting. When I finally looked out the window, the figure was gone. By morning, the man was gone too. His blanket lay discarded by the fire, and the front door was wide open. Outside, the snow was untouched except for a single set of tracks leading into the woods. They didn't belong to the man. They were too large, too deep, and too far apart. I checked into the motel just after sunset, snow crunching under my boots as I carried my bag to room 214. It wasn't much a shabby roadside place with flickering neon lights and a faded sign reading Sunny Valley Inn. The irony wasn't lost on me, considering the blizzard outside. The front desk clerk, a weary-looking woman in her 60s, handed me the key with a warning. "Storm's supposed to get worse," she said. "Stay inside tonight." I nodded, too tired to ask for details. The drive had been long, and I was only here to crash for the night before continuing on to my parents' house for New Year's Day. Room 214 was just as I expected. Dated furniture, a faint smell of mildew, and a heater that groaned like it was protesting its own existence. But it was warm, and that was enough. I unpacked my things and settled onto the lumpy bed with a book, the wind howling outside. The storm battered the building, but the walls held firm. Around 10 p.m. I heard it, muffled laughter and music coming from the room next door, 213. I wasn't annoyed, if anything, it was comforting. The sound of celebration made the storm feel less oppressive, less lonely. I imagined a group of friends or a family ringing in the new year with cheap champagne and loud toasts. By 11 p.m., the noise had grown louder. I could hear voices now, indistinct but cheerful, and the faint clinking of glasses. I thought about knocking on their door to join them, why not? But something stopped me. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was just fatigue. But I stayed in my room and let the sounds of their party drift through the thin walls. Just before midnight, I decided to grab some ice for a drink. The motel's ice machine was down the hall, past room 213. When I stepped outside, the hallway was eerily quiet. The laughter and music were gone, replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights. As I passed room 213, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of golden light spilling into the hall. "Hello?" I called out, curious. No response. I pushed the door open a little further, just enough to see inside. The room was empty. No people, no music, just an untouched bed, a static-filled TV, and a chill in the air that didn't belong in a heated motel. I backed away, my pulse quickening, and returned to my room. Midnight came, and the storm raged on. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my drink, when the sound started again. Laughter, clinking glasses, music. This time, it wasn't coming from room 213. It was coming from inside my room. The laughter was faint, like it was coming from a far corner, but it was unmistakable. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The laughter stopped. I stood frozen, my breath visible in the air, though the heater was still running. Then, slowly, the room grew colder. A shadow flickered in the mirror above the dresser just for a moment, but long enough to make my blood run cold. I turned to look, but nothing was there. By 2 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things and headed for the front desk, intending to check out. The clerk was still there, sipping coffee and watching a small TV. She looked up, surprised to see me. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Who's staying in room 213? I blurted out. Her brow furrowed. "No one. That room's been closed for years." I stared at her, unable to speak. "It's been vacant since the fire," she continued. "New Year's Eve, 1978. A group of friends rented it for a party, but something happened. No one knows exactly what, but the whole room went up in flames. They didn't make it." I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. "Then why did I hear them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me with tired eyes and shrugged. "Some guests say the same thing," she said. "Laughing, music, like they're still celebrating." I didn't wait to hear more. I got in my car and drove through the storm, the motel's lights disappearing in my rearview mirror. The next morning, as I unpacked at my parents' house, I found something strange in my bag. A small, charred piece of confetti. New Year's Eve wasn't supposed to be memorable. Just a simple night out with my two closest friends, Sarah and Mike, before we all headed back to our mundane lives after the holidays. We decided to take a drive into the countryside, a spontaneous idea sparked by the first heavy snowfall of the season. The roads were slick with ice, and the trees were shrouded in frost, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws. As we drove further into the woods, the silence outside the car became palpable. "Turn here," Sarah said suddenly, pointing to a narrow, snow-covered road. "Why?" Mike asked from the driver's seat, his tone skeptical. "I think there's an old amusement park down there," Sarah replied. "I remember my parents talking about it. It's been abandoned for years." "An amusement park? Out here?" It sounded absurd, but curiosity got the better of us. Mike sighed and turned the wheel, the tires crunching over the snow. The road led us to a rusted, sagging gate. Beyond it, the faint outline of a Ferris wheel loomed against the night sky, its metal frame dusted with snow. "This is creepy," I said, pulling my coat tighter around me as we stepped out of the car. "Exactly," Sarah grinned. "Come on, it'll be fun. How often do you get to explore something like this?" The park was a ghost of its former self. Broken rides and faded signs jutted out of the snow like forgotten relics. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional whistle of wind. And then we saw it, the carousel. It stood in the center of the park, eerily intact. Unlike the other rides, it looked almost untouched by time. The painted horses were frozen mid-gallop, their glassy eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Why does this look new?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not," Sarah said, stepping closer. "Look at the frost. It's been here forever." I didn't like how quiet it was around the carousel. The wind seemed to stop entirely as we approached, leaving only the sound of our boots crunching in the snow. "Let's take a picture," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. She climbed onto the platform, brushing snow off one of the horses. Mike hesitated but eventually followed her. "Come on, don't be boring," Sarah called to me. I reluctantly joined them, standing between two chipped wooden horses. Sarah's phone flashed as she took a picture, the light bouncing off the carousel's mirrors. And then, it moved. The carousel began to turn. Slowly at first, the creak of ancient gears filling the air. "Mike, did you touch something?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "No, I didn't do anything." The carousel picked up speed, the horses lurching as the platform spun faster and faster. "Get off!" I shouted, jumping down into the snow. Sarah and Mike followed, stumbling as the carousel spun wildly behind us. The painted horses blurred into streaks of color, their glassy eyes seeming to follow us. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the carousel. It was slowing down now, the grinding of its gears almost deafening. When it finally stopped, the horses were no longer in the same positions. They had all turned to face us. "Let's go," Mike said, his voice shaking. Now, we ran back to the car, the snow crunching beneath our frantic steps. As we climbed in and slammed the doors, I glanced back at the carousel. Something was standing on the platform, a figure, tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the frosted windows of the car. "Drive!" I shouted. Mike didn't need to be told twice. He started the engine, and we sped down the icy road, the shadowy figure disappearing into the distance. When we finally made it back to town, we were too shaken to speak. Mike dropped me off first, and I collapsed onto my bed, my heart still racing. The next morning, I checked my phone. Sarah had sent me the picture she took on the carousel. There we were, me, Sarah, and Mike, standing between the painted horses. But there was something else in the photo, a shadowy figure, standing on the edge of the platform watching us. I stared at the photo, dread pooling in my stomach, and then my phone buzzed, a new message from an unknown number. It was a single word: "Come back." I wasn't planning to spend New Year's Eve alone, but the blizzard had other plans. My flight was canceled, and the highways were a maze of closed routes and traffic. Resigned, I decided to stop at a small inn I spotted along a lonely stretch of road. The place was ancient, a relic from another era. Its sign, swinging precariously in the wind, read, "The Old Bell Manor." I stepped inside, the chill clinging to my coat, and was greeted by the innkeeper, a frail man with sharp, bird-like features. "Just for the night?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah," I replied. "Storms got me stuck." He nodded knowingly and handed me a brass key. "Room 3. Dinner's at 7 if you're hungry." And he paused, his pale blue eyes fixing on mine. "Try to ignore the clock." I frowned, unsure if I heard him correctly. "The clock?" He didn't respond. The room was simple but warm, a contrast to the howling storm outside. I dropped my bags and explored a bit, eventually making my way to the dining room for dinner. A few other guests were seated, a young couple and an older woman knitting by the fire. The air was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the flames. And then I saw it, the clock. It stood in the corner, towering over the room like an ominous sentinel. An old grandfather clock, its dark wood polished to a gleam, with ornate carvings curling around its face. The pendulum swung steadily, its soft ticks filling the silence. "What's the story with that clock?" I asked the innkeeper when he brought out my food. He stiffened. "It's been here longer than the inn itself. Some say it came with the land. Keeps perfect time, though." I nodded, though his unease was unsettling. As the evening wore on, the guests retreated to their rooms one by one. By 11:30, I was alone in the dining room, the storm outside a constant roar. I couldn't take my eyes off the clock. Something about it felt wrong. The pendulum seemed to swing slower than before, its ticks growing louder, each one resonating deep in my chest. And then, as the hands crept closer to midnight, I heard it, a faint whisper like someone speaking from just behind the clock. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. By 11:55, the air in the room had grown heavy, oppressive. I decided to leave, but as I stood, the clock began to chime. The first toll echoed through the inn, impossibly loud, shaking the walls. The fire in the hearth sputtered and went out. The second chime came, and the air grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping voices that spoke in a language I couldn't understand. By the third chime, I realized I wasn't alone. Shadows began to pool in the corners of the room, twisting and writhing. They stretched toward me, taking on vaguely human forms, their faces featureless yet somehow staring. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling. The fourth chime and the door to the dining room slammed shut. The fifth chime, and the shadows moved closer, their whispers growing to a deafening cacophony. By the sixth chime, I was pressed against the wall, too terrified to move. As the seventh chime rang out, the pendulum stopped swinging. The room fell deathly silent. And then, one of the shadows stepped forward. It raised a hand, pointing directly at me, and in a voice that sounded like the groaning of ancient wood, it spoke. "You must choose." "Choose what?" I stammered. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward the clock, which had begun to tick again, its hands racing backward. By the 11th chime, the room was spinning, the shadows circling me like vultures. My head swam, my vision blurred, and then came the 12th chime. The room went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in bed. Sunlight streamed through the window, and the storm had passed. Had it all been a dream? I dressed quickly and went downstairs. The dining room was empty, the fire crackling warmly, and the clock. It was gone. When I asked the innkeeper about it, his face went pale. "What clock?" he asked. I left without another word. A week later, I checked my phone for photos from the trip. Amid the usual snapshots of snowy roads and the inn's quaint decor, one image made my blood run cold. It was a photo of the dining room, and in the corner where the clock had stood was a shadow, a tall, faceless figure pointing directly at the camera. I'd always hated New Year's Eve. The forced cheer, the endless resolutions no one ever kept, it all felt hollow. This year I decided to skip the parties and spend the evening alone in my apartment, nursing a bottle of wine and binge-watching old sitcoms. It was peaceful, at least for the first few hours. The city outside my window buzzed with activity, honking horns, distant fireworks, the occasional cheer drifting up from the streets below. I was halfway through my third glass when I noticed something odd. The bathroom mirror. It was just barely visible from where I sat in the living room, down the hall and to the right. Normally the door blocked most of it, but I'd left it slightly ajar. The mirror's surface shimmered faintly, catching the flicker of the TV, but something about it felt wrong. At first I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe the dim lighting was playing tricks on my eyes. But when I looked closer, I could have sworn my reflection wasn't sitting still. I leaned to the left. The reflection did the same. I leaned to the right. Again, it followed. But then I stopped moving, and it didn't. The reflection leaned forward, as if peering at me through the glass. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned away, shaking my head. I told myself it was just my imagination. Too much wine, too little sleep. But I couldn't ignore it. As the night dragged on, I became increasingly aware of the mirror. No matter how much I tried to distract myself, my eyes kept darting toward the hallway. By 11:30, the air in the apartment felt heavier, colder. The sound of fireworks outside grew more frequent, each explosion punctuating the eerie silence inside. Unable to take it anymore, I got up and shut the bathroom door. "There," I muttered to myself, "problem solved." But as I turned to walk away, I heard a faint creak. The door swung open. I froze, a chill running down my spine. The mirror stood empty at first, reflecting the dim hallway behind me. But as I stared, my reflection slowly reappeared, stepping into view as if it had been hiding somewhere beyond the glass. It didn't move like me this time. Instead, it smiled. Not a friendly smile, not even a mischievous one. It was too wide, too forced, the corners of its mouth stretching unnaturally. And then it raised its hand. It pointed at the digital clock on my microwave, visible from where I stood. 11:59 p.m. The air grew colder still, the silence deafening. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The reflection's smile faded, replaced by a look of hunger. It mouthed something, its lips moving soundlessly. I didn't understand at first, Then it repeated the words more forcefully this time. "Let me out." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. Its eyes darkened, the edges of its form flickering like a static-filled screen. "Let me out," it screamed, the sound reverberating in my skull. The clock struck midnight. Outside, fireworks erupted in a cacophony of color and sound. But inside my apartment, everything seemed frozen. The reflection moved faster now, slamming its hands against the glass as though it could shatter through. Cracks began to form across the mirror's surface, spider webbing outward with each strike. I backed away, tripping over the edge of the couch and falling to the floor. "Stop," I shouted, though I knew it wouldn't listen. The cracks spread, and with one final blow, the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, like a thunderclap inside my skull. Shards of glass rained down onto the floor, glittering in the dim light. And then, silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. But as I sat there, heart pounding, I noticed something horrifying. The reflection wasn't gone. It stood among the broken glass, fully formed, its body shimmering faintly like the surface of a lake. It stared at me, tilting its head. "You let me out," it said, its voice soft but dripping with malice. Before I could react, it stepped forward, disappearing into the shadows of my apartment. I didn't sleep that night. In fact, I haven't slept much since. Every mirror in my apartment is covered now, but it doesn't matter. I still see it. In the windows, in the puddles on the street, in the corner of my eye when I least expect it. And every time, it's smiling. It was supposed to be a peaceful road trip, just a quick getaway to ring in the new year with my girlfriend Emma. We'd both been feeling the weight of the year, and a change of scenery seemed like the perfect solution. We set out early in the morning, driving down winding country roads, leaving the city far behind. The snow had begun to fall lightly when we made our first stop, a small diner on the outskirts of nowhere. The waitress, an older woman with a kind face, recommended a shortcut to our destination, a lesser-known route through the mountains. "Save you time," she said with a smile. "Not many take it, but it's a nice drive. Be careful when you reach the old bridge, though it's a bit rickety." We thanked her and, after a warm cup of coffee, set off down the path she'd suggested. The further we drove, the more isolated it became. The snow was falling heavier now, and the trees seemed to crowd in around us, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky like dark fingers. The road grew narrower, less traveled, and I began to feel a strange unease. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Emma asked, her voice tense. "I'm sure," I replied, trying to shake off my own discomfort. "It's just the weather. It's supposed to be a shortcut." But the further we went, the more something didn't feel right. There was no other traffic, no signs of life, just the eerie quiet of the snowstorm and the occasional creak of the car's suspension over the uneven road. We rounded a bend, and there it was, a village. I slammed on the brakes, skidding slightly on the ice as we came to a stop in front of an old, forgotten town. It was a scene straight out of a ghost story. Buildings lined the street, their facades weathered and decaying. The windows were dark, empty, and the streets were covered in a thick layer of snow, undisturbed by footprints or tire tracks. "Where the hell are we?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide with unease. "I don't know," I said, glancing around. "This isn't on any map." The village had a strange, almost oppressive silence to it. No animals, no birds, no sound of the wind moving through the trees. It felt like we had stepped into a place forgotten by time, a place that was never meant to be found. We decided to drive through, hoping it was just an abandoned town. But as we made our way down the main street, something caught my eye. A figure, standing at the far end of the street, staring at us. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in old, faded clothing. His face was hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, and he stood perfectly still, not moving an inch. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for us. "Let's go," Emma said, her voice tight with fear. "Something's wrong here." But before I could start the car, The figure began to walk toward us, slowly, his steps echoing in the otherwise silent town. I backed up, but the car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, then died. Damn it, I cursed, trying the ignition again, but the car refused to turn over. We need to get out of here, Emma urged, her hands shaking as she reached for the door handle. But just as she grabbed it, the door slammed shut on its own. I yanked the door handle again. Nothing. It wouldn't open. The figure was getting closer. Why won't this work? I shouted in frustration, trying every door and window. But the car was locked tight, and the figure was almost upon us. Suddenly, we heard a soft knocking. It came from the back window. I turned, heart pounding in my chest. There, standing just outside, was another figure-a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and empty, staring straight at me. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Then, she pointed toward the village. The figure at the end of the street reached the car, his eyes never leaving us. I could see now that his face was pale, unnaturally so, and his lips were twisted into a faint, mocking smile. He didn't speak, just stood there watching. I slammed my foot on the gas, desperate. The engine roared to life, and the car jerked forward, speeding out of the village. I didn't look back. We drove for what felt like hours, the snow swirling around us, the only sound the crunch of tires on ice. Emma didn't say anything, her face pale and drawn. Eventually, we saw a gas station, and I pulled in without a second thought. I turned off the engine and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That was insane, Emma said, her voice shaking. I nodded, unable to speak. My mind was still reeling from what we'd seen. As I stepped out of the car to fill up, I saw the old map hanging in the gas station window. I approached it and scanned it quickly, searching for that forgotten village. It wasn't there. I turned to the gas station attendant, a middle-aged man with a tired expression. "Excuse me," I asked, pointing to the map. "Where's this village?" The man glanced at the map, his face paling. "That village?" he said, his voice low. "It hasn't existed in over 50 years. People say it's cursed. Those who find it don't leave." I didn't stay long after that. To this day, Emma and I never speak of that night. I don't know what happened to that village or how we found it, but sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees or the snow falls too thickly, I feel a presence watching. And I know, somewhere, in that forgotten place, the people who live there are still waiting for someone else to stumble upon them. It was supposed to be a quick trip. I was heading home from a business conference, a long but uneventful journey by train through the countryside. I had taken the 10 p.m. express, the last one of the night, expecting to settle into my seat, lose myself in a book, and drift off as the train swayed gently along the tracks. But something felt off from the moment I boarded. The train was quieter than usual. No chatter from fellow passengers, no bustling in the aisles. Just a handful of people scattered throughout the cars, all sitting in absolute silence. I dismissed it at first, thinking everyone was tired from long days of work. I found my seat, a window seat, and sank into it. The overhead lights flickered once or twice, but nothing out of the ordinary. As we began moving, I pulled out my phone to check for any messages, but I noticed something strange. The time on my phone was wrong. It wasn't a huge discrepancy, just a few minutes off, but it was enough to catch my attention. I brushed it off as a glitch, but as the train passed through the countryside, the world outside seemed to blur. The snow on the ground turned to a strange dark fog that twisted around the train like smoke. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to clear my vision, but it didn't help. Then, the lights flickered again and the train seemed to slow down. I glanced at the clock above the door and it was 11:58. I had been on the train for over an hour, but the time didn't seem to match up. I looked down the aisle and saw one of the passengers, a man in a long coat, standing up. He was staring at the door at the far end of the car, his eyes wide. "What's wrong?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just kept staring at the door, his expression unreadable. I stood up to approach him, but before I could take a step, the train lurched violently. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air, and for a moment I thought we had derailed. But the train didn't stop, it kept moving, almost as if it were being pulled forward by some invisible force. I looked around, but the passengers were still silent, frozen in their seats, their eyes wide and unblinking. It was as though time had stopped. Then, the man at the end of the car turned to face me, his eyes now wide with terror. "It's coming," he whispered. "It's coming for us." Before I could ask what he meant, the train jerked again, harder this time. The lights dimmed, then went out entirely. The train plunged into darkness. I could hear the faint sound of whispers, voices I couldn't make out, coming from the back of the car. I tried to pull my phone out to use the flashlight, but it had no signal. The train rumbled on, the eerie silence broken only by the low, distant hum of the engine. I reached for the emergency button, but as my hand brushed it, the train lurched once more, throwing me against the seat. When I recovered, I looked up. The scenery had changed. Instead of the dark countryside, there were now mountains looming, jagged peaks that I was certain had not been there before. The fog had thickened, swirling outside the window, pressing against the glass. The train seemed to be moving faster now, and the strange whispers were growing louder. It was then that I realized the train had no destination. A cold chill ran down my spine. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and stumbled toward the door. I had to get off. Whatever was happening, I couldn't just sit there. As I reached the door, it opened with a loud creak, revealing an empty corridor. I stepped into the hall, only to find that the other cars were now empty as well. There were no passengers, no attendants, just the same eerie silence and the growing hum of the engine. I walked the length of the train, but when I reached the rear door, something stopped me. The figure from earlier, the man in the long coat, was standing at the end of the car again, staring at the door. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "It's too late," he whispered as I approached. "You can't escape." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned, opening the door to the outside world. I rushed forward, grabbing his arm, but it was as though he wasn't real. My hand passed right through him. Then the train seemed to disappear. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my seat again, the train moving steadily along the tracks. The lights were back on, and the scenery outside had returned to normal. The snow was falling softly, and everything looked peaceful. But when I checked my phone, it was still off, the screen frozen, and the time 11:58. I couldn't understand what had just happened. I looked around the car, but the man in the coat was gone. The other passengers were still there, but they were staring straight ahead, not speaking, not moving. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, but nothing else. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the clock, willing it to move. But when the train finally pulled into the station, it was as though nothing had changed. I stepped off the train, breathing in the crisp night air, and checked the time again. It was midnight. The station was empty, and the world seemed to have reset itself. But when I glanced back toward the train, I saw it. The train was gone. There was no sign of it, no trace of its tracks, just an empty platform and the eerie silence of the night. I haven't ridden a train since that night, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear it, the whispers, the hum, the sound of a train that never stops, and I wonder if it will ever find me again. It was meant to be a quiet New Year's Eve, just a weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods, away from the chaos of the city. My girlfriend Lucy and I were looking forward to a few days of peace, relaxing by the fire and letting the old year slip away. We rented the cabin from a small family-run agency in a remote area, deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. The cabin itself was cozy, nestled between tall pines that towered like ancient sentinels, blocking out most of the daylight. When we arrived, the place felt welcoming, even if there was an odd stillness about the surrounding woods. Lucy chalked it up to the winter air, the kind that freezes everything into silence. We unloaded our bags, set up our space, and by nightfall, the only light was the flickering warmth of the fire and a few old lamps in the cabin. But that's when the first thing happened. It started around 10 p.m., just after we'd finished dinner. We were sitting on the couch, chatting about our plans for the new year, when I noticed a faint light moving outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the reflection from the fire, but when I glanced up, the light was still there, hovering in the woods, just beyond the tree line. "Look at that," I said, pointing it out to Lucy. She looked up, squinting at the window. "It's probably just someone hiking or hunting. It's so dark out there, though, that's weird." I nodded, still watching. The light wasn't moving like a person would move. It drifted in unpredictable patterns, hovering and swaying as though caught in the wind. I thought it might have been a lantern or a flashlight, but the more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't a steady beam. It danced, flickered, and then just disappeared behind the trees. "Maybe it's just some wildlife, like deer or something," I suggested. But something about the movement of the light unsettled me. It felt wrong. We decided to go outside, not out of fear but curiosity. I grabbed a flashlight from the cabin and led the way into the snowy night. The cold bit at my skin as we trudged through the thick layer of snow, my boots crunching with each step. The woods around us were unnervingly still, the trees standing like silent witnesses. After a few minutes, we reached the spot where we had seen the light, but there was nothing. The snow was undisturbed, the forest quiet. "See? It was probably nothing," Lucy said, trying to reassure me. But I wasn't convinced. I had a strange feeling that we weren't alone. I shone my flashlight around, scanning the darkened woods, and that's when I saw it again. A small light, floating just beyond the trees, this time brighter and more distinct. It wasn't moving like it had before, but it was pulsing, almost like a heartbeat, casting a soft glow against the blackness of the forest. "Do you see that?" I whispered, but Lucy didn't respond. I turned around to find her staring at something behind me, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, turning. That's when I saw it too. The lights. There were more of them now, 3, 4, maybe 5. They were scattered around the clearing, floating just above the snow, like will-o'-the-wisps, drifting aimlessly through the trees. They flickered in and out of view, their movements erratic, like they were aware of us, watching us. "Let's go back," Lucy said, her voice trembling. I agreed, but as we turned to leave, the lights followed. Slowly at first, then faster, moving in jerky, erratic movements, circling around us. We ran. The snow crunched under our feet, and the wind howled in our ears as we rushed back to the cabin. But the lights were still there, darting through the trees, chasing us like they were alive. I could hear them now, 2 faint whispers, like voices calling out to us from the darkness. By the time we reached the cabin, the lights had stopped following. They hovered just outside the window, still flickering like distant stars. I slammed the door shut and locked it, but it didn't feel like enough. The air inside the cabin felt suffocating, thick with an unspoken fear. "Are you okay?" Lucy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. The lights were still out there just beyond the window, and I knew they weren't going away. We spent the rest of the night by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside and the occasional creak of the cabin's wooden walls. But the lights never came any closer, and eventually we fell asleep, exhaustion taking over. The next morning, we awoke to a pristine winter morning. The sun was out, and the snow glittered like diamonds across the landscape. The events of the previous night felt surreal, like a nightmare fading in the light of day. But when we stepped outside to leave, I froze. The lights were there again, but this time they weren't hovering in the trees. They were in the snow. Footprints, glowing faintly, leading from the tree line to the cabin. They were fresh. They hadn't been there when we first arrived, and they were still coming. I don't know what those lights were or what they wanted. All I know is that I never went back to that cabin. I tried to find out more about it, but no one seemed to know where it was. It's as if the place never existed. Sometimes when I'm out walking late at night, I see a flicker of light in the distance. I look away quickly, hoping it's nothing. But deep down, I know better. The lights that wandered are still out there, and one day they might come for me again.